Hey, it's Mr. Van Dong again. Day 5 of our distance learning, and we are starting a brand new chapter in our My Math books. We're going to chapter 11, which is all about measurement. We're going to start out with measuring customary length. First of all, just in case any of you are like, oh, I'm going to work ahead in my math book or something like that, don't do that. Don't do that in general, but especially in this chapter, there'll be lessons that get rearranged and all sorts of stuff because measurement's weird and we rearrange it, which you don't care. Anyway, but the first thing I have to do is apologize to you. I have to apologize to you that you live in one of the 3 countries on the earth that still uses the customary system. What's the customary system? Well, it seems normal to you to measure distances of length in things like feet and miles and yards, or weight in pounds, or capacity in gallons and things like that. But actually, the only countries in the whole world that do that are the United States, Myanmar, and Liberia. Everybody else uses the metric system. And you also have to do the metric system because it's the system that science uses. You might have noticed that anytime that we do science, you always are using the metric system. When we were doing water, we were using liters of water. Okay, well, you don't go to the store and go buy a liter of milk. You buy a gallon of milk in the United States, which is the way it is. I don't know why. We almost switched, by the way. This is like a random fact time question that you didn't ask. But we almost switched to the metric system in, I believe, the 1960s, and people panicked and were like, change is bad, we can't do it. So now we still have feet and all that other stuff. It'd be nice if one day we changed, but we won't. So anyway, the bottom line is there's 2 systems of measurement. You can measure all sorts of different things with either system. You can measure mass and weight. You can measure length. You can measure how much water fits into something. All of these things, there's different types of measurement. Measure temperature and stuff like that. So, but we're starting with length, and we're starting with the customary system. So the words that you hear coming out of my mouth will be pretty familiar to you because you've been hearing them since, before you could speak. You heard people talking about how many feet something was, miles per hour, all of those things. So they seem like, oh yeah, customary system, that makes sense. Why does Mr. Van Dong hate the customary system? Well, I hate it because it doesn't make sense at all. And which is kind of what tomorrow's lesson is going to be about, which will be next week for you guys. But when we start talking about how to convert units in the customary system, none of it makes sense. You just have to memorize stuff, which is the worst. It's the worst to be like, sorry, you have to memorize this. But that's how customary system works. Metric system, on the other hand, it works wonderfully, and we'll learn about that later on in the chapter. Let me introduce you to a ruler. I'm sure you've seen these before. Speaking of the system, see how there's this one system, messing with the camera, up here. This is millimeters and centimeters and parts of a meter. You know that I often like to walk around class with my meter stick, and some kids say, hey, you've got a yardstick. No, I don't. I've got a meter stick. So we've got one side that is the metric system, and then the other side is the customary system, which is inches. So your typical school ruler is 1 foot long, which most of you probably have memorized as 12 feet. Now, this lesson on page 801, if you don't have a ruler at home, it's got this section right here. You can use scissors or just carefully tear this section out right here. And use that as your measurement tool today. So everybody has a ruler. You can use your own ruler, or you can use the ruler in the book. It doesn't matter. Everything that you measure will be less than 3 inches. When we're measuring things today, we will always have 2 answers to every question because you're always asked to measure either to the nearest ½ inch or to the nearest ¼ inch. So we're either measuring to the nearest ½ inch or to the nearest ¼ inch for whatever we're measuring. So it's always going to be 2 answers. Sometimes the answers will actually be the same, which is kind of interesting. But we'll talk more about that as we get into it. So that I don't have to constantly hold a ruler up to the camera, I've drawn a blown up ruler right here that's much bigger than an actual ruler. This is to represent inches here so that we can talk about how a ruler is divided. You can see that like a number line, there are whole numbers going from left to right. Those whole numbers are whole inches. And then there are a bunch of little tiny hash marks. And those are showing how if you evenly divide every inch up into either halves, fourths, or eighths, what that space looks like. So the distance that the line goes down is trying to help your eyes quickly see where the half-inch marks are, the quarter-inch marks are, and the eighth-inch marks are. If you get out something like a tape measure or a more scientific ruler, you'll get 1/16 of an inch too. And sometimes people even measure to a 32nd of an inch. We're only concerned with the nearest half-inch and quarter-inch as fifth graders. So what you need to be familiar with is finding whole inches, which those are straightforward, right? This is the whole numbers. Where are the half inches and where are the quarter inches on your ruler? The half inch is, and I know this is shocking, halfway in between each whole number. And you can see that line's always a little bit longer there. So if we're measuring something to the nearest half inch, our answer is always going to be 0, 1/2, 1 whole, 1.5, 2, 2.5, 3, 3.5, or whatever. So measuring to the nearest half. It doesn't mean that the answer has to actually end with a half. Like if something is, like this, that's a bad example. And now I erased part of my board. Oh, Mr. Van Dong, you got to plan these things better. If I was measuring something that was really, really close to 1 inch, I wouldn't say it's 1.5 inches just because it's, let me try to fix this, just because it's, because I'm told to measure to the nearest half inch. So if something's really close to 1 inch and I'm measuring to the nearest half inch, the answer is 1. It's close to 1 inch. 1 inch is part of the halves, right? If I'm counting by halves, that includes all the whole numbers, is a way to think about it. Quarter inches are, again, shocking. If you break every whole up into 4 equal pieces, that's cutting it 3 times, like we have with fractions, you see not only the half inch is included in that, but also this. So if I were going to write this like a number line, so let me do it in red to draw your eyes to it. I'll do the half inches in blue. So this would be 1/2, and this would be another 1 1/2, right? 2 1/2, and so on. And I know I wrote smaller. You can probably see, but you can, it'll work out. These other, it's also in your book, right? In the diagram, it shows this too. These other ones in between here are showing 1/4 of an inch. And then 1/2 of an inch is 2/4 of an inch, right? If you've gone 2 out of 4, that's a half. So this is 2/4, which is a half. And then you've got 3/4, and then you've got 1 whole. And then you've got 1 1/4, and 1 1/2, 1 2/4, 1 1/2, and then 1 3/4. And then 2 wholes, and then 2 1/4, 2 1/2, 2 3/4, and 3, and it just goes on forever, is how that works. So when we're measuring things today, every time we will measure them to the nearest half and to the nearest quarter inch. Go ahead and take a look in your book, and it shows a button down at the bottom, a giant button for giants. And it's actually scaled correctly, so if you get your ruler out, it should match up the same with these measurements. Now, anytime you're measuring something, the first step is always to make sure that you line up the 0 of the ruler with the start of the object. Some rulers start at the very end is 0, and some rulers, like this one here, you can see that 0 actually starts like, a 1/8 of an inch in. So you have to actually line up where 0 is with one side of the object and then go to the other. The other thing is you need to make sure that you're measuring in a very straight line across the object that you're measuring. If you measure a little diagonally, a diagonal line might give you a really inaccurate estimate. On this first one, the object's round, so it doesn't really matter if it's diagonal or not too much. But on other objects, it's going to be really important that you not measure diagonally. So we can see here in the book that the measurement here, they've drawn the line, it goes somewhere in between 1 1/2 and 1 3/4 of an inch. 1 whole, and then 1 whole inch, and then 1 1/2 and 1 3/4. If we're measuring that button to the nearest half, we need to ignore the 3/4 of an inch for a hot minute, okay? So if you're measuring to the nearest half, you're asking yourself the question, is that line right there, is it closer to 1 1/2 or is it closer to 2? Because those are the nearest half inches. Well, it's closer to 1 1/2. So the answer to the first warm-up problem would be 1 1/2. It's closer to 1 1/2. And yeah, it rounds down a little bit to 1 1/2 inches. Then for the second part of the problem, if we're measuring it to the nearest quarter inch, then we have to decide, is it closer to 1.5 or 1 3/4? We count, Mr. Van Dong, you're measuring to the nearest quarter, so you shouldn't look at the half. 1/2 is 2/4. It is 2/4. So we do need to look at the halves and the wholes when we're using quarters. So we're asking the question, is that a little bit closer to 1.5 or a little bit closer to 1 3/4? It's a little bit closer to 1 3/4. So 1 3/4 would be the answer to that first warm-up problem. Okay, turn the page. And let's do another one. Let's take a look at this next thing. It says, find the length of a paper clip. Okay, well, everybody get out your paper clip. You don't have a paper clip? Okay, let's pick something we all have. Hey, we've all got this helpful hints bubble, right? Let's do the helpful hints bubble instead, okay? Anytime this assignment refers to an object that you're supposed to go seek and find, if you can't find it, pick something else. You don't get to skip the problem. You get to pick something else that you want to measure instead, okay? So I'm going to erase the previous answers. Whoop, whoop. And then sound effects help, can you tell? And I'm going to measure the width of the helpful hints area here. So the first step is to line up my ruler on the 0 on the very, very leftmost edge, and then to take a look. And I'm counting not just the dark blue part, but or the light blue part that's filled in all the way out there. So I can see here it's looking pretty close to 3. It's looking pretty close to 3. If I'm measuring it to the nearest half, I need to look at 2.5, and I need to look at 3. And if I look at the 2.5 and I look at the 3, I can see that dark blue line there, it's much closer to 3 holes than 2.5. So the solution, my answer for the helpful hint bubble would be, it is to the nearest ½ inch, it's 3 inches. It's very close to 3 inches. Then for the nearest quarter inch, I line it up again. I'm going to measure the width again. Oh, by the way, when you're measuring to the nearest quarter inch for something that's like, this is a good example of, if you kind of measure it this way versus this way, you might get a slightly different answer. So be very careful to be trying to measure straight across, and we're going from the widest distance to the widest distance. So I've got it lined up there. Again, it's very close to 3 holes, but I have to ask myself, is it closer to 2 3/4 or is it closer to 3 holes? If I look carefully, I should see it is closer to 3 holes than 2 3/4. So my answer for measuring the helpful hint bubble to the nearest quarter inch is also 3 holes. So you can see that sometimes the answer to your question will be the same. It might be the same thing. If you're measuring to the nearest half or measuring to the nearest quarter, in some cases you get the same measurement. So be aware of that. That doesn't always happen, but it happens sometimes. All right, there's a talk about it section down here, and go ahead and pause the video and try to fill that out on your own. If there are things that you can't fill out, it's okay. I'm going to go over the answers in a second. So fill out as much as you can of the first 3 problems here, and then go ahead and pause the video. Hey, you unpaused the video, I'm back! Or you didn't pause the video, and then that was just like a weird, awkward silence, but hopefully you paused it. Number 1 said, explain how you can tell the difference between the ½ inch and quarter inch marks when measuring an object with a ruler. And the way that you can quickly tell is the length of that marking on the ruler. The longer the length is, it's the closer it is basically to a hole. So you have to look at the length of the hash mark is one way that you can think about it. You can also think about dividing it like into a bar diagram, where one hole's been divided into 2 versus into fourths, and look at it that way. That's also fine. Number 2 said, will you ever have the same answer when measuring to the nearest ½ inch and measuring to the nearest quarter inch? Explain your reasoning. Yes, you will, because sometimes measuring to the nearest half or measuring to the nearest quarter inch can result in the same answer. Now that's not a very good explanation because I basically just repeated my answer. If I want to get more specific, I can say, look, when I'm measuring to the nearest quarter inch, that also includes ½ inches and whole inches. So the only time I would have a different answer is if I'm measuring to the nearest quarter inch, it's closest to a quarter, to a 1/4 or to a 3/4. Otherwise, it will have been the same answer. Okay, And last, it says circle the more precise measurement of the button in the first activity. More precise is just another way of saying more accurate. And it's always more accurate to use a smaller measurement. So measuring to the nearest quarter inch is 100% of the time more accurate and more precise. It's just like rounding to the nearest 10 versus rounding to the nearest million. You know, if I say, oh my gosh, I've got $99 about how much money I have, round it to the nearest million. Mr. Van Dong, you have about $0. If I'm rounding to the nearest million, it's not even close to a million. But $99, something to spit at. That's not nothing. So rounding to the nearest million gives us a not very precise estimate of what we have. Whereas if I said round $99 to the nearest 10, you'd say, oh, 99, that's between 90 and 100. It's really close to 100. You've got about $100, Mr. Van Dong. And I'd say, you're right, I do. And I'm going to use that to buy coffee and ice cream cake all day, every day, until I run out. Not really. I'll be more responsible. I'll put it in the bank, and I'll not buy video games with it. I don't promise. Okay, you're doing the practice it section. There's two things that they've already got here for you to measure, and then there's other things where you find them in your house. Work on that, and then flip the page over and continue to work on this section here, doing all those problems. Again, 45 minutes-ish minus the length of this video should get you there just about. If you finish early, then just keep on trucking along the rest of the packet, and I will see you next week. Oh, and don't forget to turn in your packets on Monday. So all of this work that you've been doing in your math book, this stuff, I don't want to see it. Please don't send it back. It's too much paper. You keep that in your math book just like normal. Your homework that I've been asking you to do, and I've given instructions for this, but just as a verbal reminder, your homework is getting torn out and turned back into us. So your teachers can see that you're doing your homework and all that good stuff. But as far as what the test from yesterday, the homework, those are the parts of math that are going to come back that we're going to look at and that we're going to grade you on, and not grade like, did you get every homework problem right, but did you do it, right? Responsibility grade. And then we'll grade the test and we'll give you feedback on that so you know how you did. So make sure that you turn those things in. And we'll talk to you next week. Have a nice weekend after the end of the school day, because you still have more. You're watching this at the beginning of your day. You still should have. Goodbye.